Welcome to the Design Portal BootCamp lesson on global entities and user entities. In this lesson, we're going to go over what a global entity is, what a user entity is, when to use them, and how to set them up. We'll start this lesson talking about global entities. Think of a global entity as a read-only object that each client can request from the brainCloud server. In this lesson, we'll be using global entities to generate game data that could be used in a game or app. By storing your app's data in global entities, you can then later make changes to entity data without having to make a patch for each platform that your game is published on. This can save a major headache and a lot of time. From the dashboard, click Global, then Global Data, followed by Global Entities. On the right, click the Create button. Give the entity a type and an indexed ID. The indexed ID allows for a faster lookup. Below that, there's an option to set an owner ID. Here, you would enter a valid user profile ID. However, that is discouraged for global entities, and in fact, we have user entities for owned entities. We'll be covering user entities later in this lesson. The next option is ACL. Think of ACL as permissions. The default is public read, which we'll be using for this entity. The other two values are public read write and private. Private means that the entity is only accessible to the owner of the entity. The last option is called time to live. Perhaps you want a global entity to only exist for a certain duration. Once that time to live value expires, then the global entity will be destroyed. It should be noted that you should never exceed 1,000 global entities. If your game does in fact need more than 1,000 global entities, we recommend using custom entities instead. We'll be covering custom entities in a future lesson. At the top, click Data. Delete the generated data. We're going to enter some enemy data that we can tune at any time if we determine that it is not well balanced in our fictitious game or app. The global entity will hold 5 different enemy types. When all the data has been entered, click Save. Let's create a second global entity. Click the Create button. Enter weapon data as the entity type. Then enter game data as the indexed ID. There's a request that we're going to see in a moment that returns all the entities with the same indexed ID, so we'll be able to get the enemy data and the weapon data with a single request. Click Data, delete the generated data. We're going to enter some weapon data. The global entity will hold 4 different weapon types. When completed, click the Save button. A useful feature of global entities is automatic versioning. To demonstrate this, let's make a change to the weapon data global entity. Click the global entity, then click Edit. We're going to modify the ballistic weapons data. When completed, click Save. Notice that the weapon data entity's version automatically incremented to version 2. Since this bootcamp is all about the design portal and not a specific platform, we'll use the API Explorer to cover any important requests that you'll need to make from the client. On the left, click Design, then Cloud Code, followed by API Explorer. First, we need to authenticate. Then, from the service drop-down list, select Global Entity. From the operation drop-down list, select Get List by Indexed ID. In the Parameters section, enter game data as the entity indexed ID value. Click Execute to run the request. Notice that in the response that both weapon data and the enemy data global entities were returned. That's because both entities had game data set as their indexed ID. In your game or app, you'll need to parse this JSON data that the GetList by Indexed ID request returned. Now let's talk about user entities. User entities are similar to global entities with a few key differences. Essentially, a user entity provides developers a way to store user-owned JSON data on the brainCloud servers. This JSON data can be created and then updated as needed. It's now time to talk about one of the major differences from global entities. User entities are not created on the design portal, but rather dynamically via API calls. To help understand user entities and the requests needed, let's go over a high-level example. First, the user opens the app and authenticates with brainCloud. On a successful authentication request, the getEntities by type request will be invoked, passing in the entity type to return. If the response contains an empty array of entities, that means that the user entity for the supplied entity type has not been created yet for this user. As a result, the create entity request will be made, passing in the entity type, the JSON data object, and the ACL as the parameters. The user entity is then created on the server and a response is returned. The user plays the game and improves their ship stats. The update entity request would then be made to update brainCloud with the changes to the user's entity data. The user then decides that they are done playing and they log off the game. Later, the user decides to play the game again and the app authenticates with brainCloud. On a successful authentication, the app will then make the get entities by type request. This time, the response will contain an array with the user entity data. That's because the user entity data was created during the previous play session. The user plays the game and doesn't do very well. The player's ship has taken a lot of damage. The update entity request is then made to update brainCloud with the changes to the user's entity data. To simplify user entities, we'll step through the same 3 requests in the API Explorer. From the service dropdown list, select entity. From the operation dropdown list, select get entities by type. In the parameters section, enter ship data as the entity type value. Click execute to run the request. Notice in the response the entities array is empty. That tells us that this player does not have a user entity created with the ship data entity type. On the client, if the array is empty, you would then follow that up with a create entity request to create the user data. Let's do that request now in the API Explorer. From the operation dropdown list, select create entity. In the parameters section, we need to enter the entity type, the data, and the ACL. For the entity type, enter ship data as the value. For the data, we'll enter properties that describes the user's ship. For the ACL value, we'll leave it at 0, which means that the data is private and only accessible by the user that created the user entity. Click execute to run the request. The user entity was created successfully. We can confirm this by rerunning the get entities by type request. In the parameters section, enter ship data as the entity type value. Click execute to run the request. Notice in the response, the entities array is not empty and contains the entity data that we created a moment ago. We can even view individual users' entity data from the Design Portal. On the left, click Users, then User Browser. Click the top user in the list. A side pane will pop out from the right side. Click the Go to User button. This screen displays information about the selected user. With the user selected, we can now access the user entity data. On the left, click Data, then User Entities. Click the entity to see its data. If desired, you can even click the Edit button to modify the user's data. Note that a user can have multiple user entities. Next, let's learn how to update the user entity data. On the left, click Design, then Cloud Code followed by API Explorer. From the Operations drop-down list, select Update Entity. A few things about this request. It requires the entity ID of the entity you want to update. You also have to provide all the data in its current state in the data object. This data will completely replace the existing entity data on the brainCloud server. In the response, copy the entity ID. In the parameter section, paste in the entity ID for the entity ID value. Then enter ship data as the entity type value. Then in the data object, set the updated data. The ship's health, damage, max speed, and weapons have been increased. Leaving the version as -1 will automatically increment it to the next logical value, so in this case, version 2. Click execute to make the request. The request was successful and the user entity data was updated. Let's check out the changes. From the operations drop-down list, select get entities by type. In the parameters section, enter ship data as the entity type value. Click execute to make the request. Notice the updated user entity data was returned in the response. Now we'll learn how to delete a user entity. From the drop-down list, select delete entity. In the parameters section, paste in the entity ID that's still copied to the clipboard as the entity ID value. Click execute to make the request. The user entity has now been deleted. We'll confirm this by returning to the user browser. Click Users, then User Browser. Click the top user in the list, and then from the side panel, click Go to User. On the left, click Data, then User Entities. Notice that the user entity no longer exists. This concludes this lesson on global entities and user entities. As you've seen, global entities and user entities are incredibly powerful, simple to set up and modify, and very useful. However, you may find your game or app needs more customization, performance, and scalability than global entities and user entities can provide. This is where custom entities would come in. We'll be covering custom entities in an upcoming lesson. Exporting and importing global entities is the next lesson in the Design Portal BootCamp.